Okay, so yeah, the title of my talk is Under-Resourced or Overloaded, Rethinking Working Memory Deficits and Developmental Language Disorder. This talk is based on a paper currently under review, but available as a preprint, which I'll link at the end of the talk if you want to dig in further and see more about it. So as the title suggests, the population of interest in this study is children with developmental language disorder. So developmental language disorder, or DLD, is formerly known as specific language impairment, or SLI. And this is diagnosed in children when a child has severe language deficits in the absence of any clear biomedical cause, such as we see in the chromosomal abnormalities in Down syndrome, for example. So this can affect all levels of the language system, from the phoneme through word and chunk level syntax, through to pragmatics, discourse, etc. It affects around 7.5% of English-speaking children. So this is quite prevalent. And as you can imagine, given that language is so central to our lives, it comes with significant social, emotional, academic, and employment costs. So the good news is that professional support, for example, the support of a speech and language therapist, can make a difference. And so providing work that gets this right, that helps get this right, is really the thrust of what we do in our lab. Now, one of the most dominant accounts of DLD is centers around the idea of a working memory capacity bottleneck. And working memory here is understood under the sort of Baddeley and Hitch 1974 model of the executive, the central executive, and then the buffer systems of the phonological loop, etc. Specifically, the phonological loop is of interest in DLD research. So this account goes as follows. We have a low-level sensory representation. So here we have a spectrogram to capture this. We have frequency information over time. This might be pattern of firing in spiral ganglion cells in the basilar membrane as early as possible in the auditory linguistic pathways you can get. This signal travels down the auditory linguistic pathway, and at some point we hit a working memory capacity bottleneck, typically defined as a phonological loop capacity deficit. And this results in the formation of long-term speech representations, which in the literature to date have been simply termed in sort of verbal accounts, fuzzy or degraded or vague. And of course, this compromises the whole language system. Whether we're looking at production or comprehension, the whole thing sort of falls apart. Now, this view of DLD is massively dominant within the field, and it informs clinical practice. So many of by clinical practice, I mean identifying children who are at risk or who have language impairments, and then treating them and trying to boost their social and educational outcomes. So for example, if we look at one of the most common packages used by speech and language therapists, this is the SELF or KELF5. Working memory tasks such as the familiar sequences and number repetition tasks are absolutely central to these things. And these are widely interpreted as tapping phonological loop or working memory capacity, and deficits in these tasks among children with DLD are understood as signaling a working memory capacity deficit. And the influence of this account goes beyond clinical practice, strictly defined. If we think about things like applications such as one called jungle memory, which make the claim of being able to train working memory capacity, and again, in doing so, boost educational outcomes. So jungle memory is a very well-known case. And just to show that this isn't sort of a straw man argument I'm building here, here's a question raised on the Mumsnet Caregiver Information Exchange forum by a teacher who says, I have 2 children in my class who've been assessed as having incredibly poor working memory. The teacher does some Googling and comes across jungle memory and then says, the results are promising, but it's incredibly expensive, which it is. And I would like something other than the company's propaganda to point to as evidence. Now, unfortunately for the jungle memory team, the evidence for working memory training is quite poor. So a lot of this work has come out of the University of Oxford, of Charles Hume's lab, where they report very few transfer effects for working memory training, that is effects that work across different tasks, and very few long-lasting effects. So this kind of puts a question mark, along with a number of other factors, puts a question mark over the dominance of the working memory capacity bottleneck in causal accounts of DLD. The problem is we really don't have a cohesive alternative. And so if you dip into any study on developmental language disorder, which again affects around 7.5% of children in the UK, actually you'll commonly see this idea of just a working memory capacity bottleneck just thrown around without much great consideration. So given the problems in the literature and how important it is to get this right, we wanted to develop a cohesive alternative to this account. And as a first stage in the development of this hypothesis, we turned to computer modeling and specifically a deep learning framework. So I know this is very familiar to this audience. We have a convolutional neural network here, which takes in a spectrogram, like you saw earlier, with frequency information over frames of time. This is passed through 20 convolutional layers in our case, and each input spoken word exemplar is classified as one of 35 words, and we'll get to that a bit later. So this kind of model has been taken into account as account, of course, of the visual processing system, and more recently, especially in terms of the auditory linguistic pathway. So just as a quick refresher, we go from, we have spoken word, for example, the signal enters through the exterior auditory canal, we go through the middle ear, and we hit at some point the basilar membrane and prompt a pattern of firing in spiral ganglion cells. This signal then travels down the auditory nerve, and we go through a number of substructures in the brainstem before we arrive at the auditory cortex, in which we have other substructures. We have the core belt and parabelt. So what are the similarities between the biological and artificial systems? Well, of course, this is a massive, massive ongoing question. Two that are commonly cited are, first, projection into over-complete space. So in biological system, for example, we have 35 to 50,000 spiral ganglion cells in the basilar membrane. And further downstream, we have about 100 million neurons in the auditory cortex. And what this means is a pattern of activation instantiated in a low-level structure can be represented in a relatively small subspace of a high-level structure, in essence. We also have, in both systems, we'll have, of course, pooling functions. And here we have a sort of a schematic of the auditory cortex. We have the core and the belt here. And you can see in the core, you have neurons firing to very specific frequencies, 200 up to about 200 hertz and beyond. And then in the belt, you have a single pooling function neuron, which fires to any antecedent activity in the range of 200 to 400 hertz. Okay, so a very cursory glance at this stuff, but the key point is that these sorts of features underpin active transformation, not simply passing of the signal along. When we think about what this transformation looked like, well, we're going from noise-sensitive representations in lower-level structures to speech-selective representations in higher-level structures. And of course, we see a similar thing in the visual system where we have these hypothesized grandmother neurons, for example. One way to study this transformation recently, of course, has been the idea of neural manifolds. And so a quick primer on neural manifolds, again, I'm sure this is quite familiar to you. We looked at a number of structures in the auditory linguistic pathway. And in each structure, we have a population of neurons. So here we have neuron 1, 2, 3, 4, and N. Let's look at this in terms of early on in the processing stream in this case. We hear a word, and this prompts a pattern of firing. Here, the bars represent spikes per second in each of these neurons. Because we have noise-sensitive responses early in the processing system, which are picking up on, for example, speaker effect, background noise, co-articulation effects, two exemplars of a given word are going to prompt a slightly different pattern of activation early on in the system. So here you can see that in different responses in each neuron. And indeed, you might have competitor words such as catch, which prompt patterns of firing which are actually kind of similar to some of the competitor words. So here you can see in the response of neuron N, for example, the second instance of the word cat and catch look fairly similar in terms of their intensity, in terms of spikes per second. Now, of course, you can take these and you can plot them in high dimensional space. So here we have that, and you can see in this 2D rendering at least, one instance of cat looks quite similar to one instance of catch, and the other two instances of cat seem more further away, again in this 2D rendering. So the point of learning in these kind of systems, it's been argued, is if we collect all those versions of cat and put them together, you can see them here. What we're doing in learning a representation of the word cat is interpolating over this cluster and learning a sort of neural manifold, which we can determine if if a new response vector resides within this manifold, it's highly likely to be an instance of cat. If the vector resides outside of this neural manifold, it's unlikely to be an instance of cat. It might be an instance of the competitor word catch, for example. So we talked about having noise sensitive and then going to speech selective responses. And in terms of neural manifolds, it's been argued that this might look a bit like this. Early on in the processing stream, we might go from tangled neural manifolds. So here we have a neural manifold of cat, catch, and cot, which are highly intersected and overlapping. And throughout those processes of including the projection into over complete space and pooling functions, we end up with transformed representations that look a bit like this. They've been reduced in dimensionality and they're highly separable. And those are two really key features. We have the activated sort of long-term memory shape, and we have its separability from others. And those are the two sort of mechanisms we're going to look at today. We take the former in terms of manifold dimensionality as the shape of activated long-term memory, and what's called the classification capacity, that is the ability to separate those representations, as proxy for an attentional control system, which sort of peers inside its activated long-term memory, which occurs in response to a given signal, and tries to separate and work with those as a sort of retrieval mechanism. So in our task, I mean, it was dead simple. We wanted to be reproducible, and we wanted people who are DLD researchers with an interest in computational modeling to be able to dabble in this. We took spoken words, we presented them to a neural network, and we got the neural network to, of course, classify each spoken word spectrogram as one of 35 words. And again, we trained on very computationally tractable training sizes with 4,000 training words, 1,000 testing words. Now, our only independent variable was whether the spectrograms we input to the system were clean or noisy to represent typical development and DLD respectively. And this is based on work from Bishop and MacArthur and Bishop, published in 2005, who identified spectral processing deficits among children with DLD. What these researchers found was that children with DLD often struggle to differentiate pure tones in the region of 600 to 700 hertz. And even when that behavioral threshold was met, they still showed atypical waveforms in EEG experiments, sort of signifying that the problem might be quite widespread. So we centered on this spectral processing deficit in a sort of crude way, just adding noise to the low-level spectrograms input into this convolutional neural network. We didn't make any processing limitation changes to the architecture that was modeling the DLD children. For example, we didn't reduce hidden layer size, which is a common approach in the computational modeling of DLD. We didn't add high dropout rates or restrict the learning rate, for example. There were no architectural differences like that. And this was, again, to help us develop a cohesive version or a cohesive account of DLD in which working memory capacity limitations that are hard-coded and independent of long-term memory played no part. So in terms of the dependent variables, we were looking at performance factors. So we looked, of course, at classification accuracy, and we looked at the entropy and probability of predictive distributions output. So we took a high probability, low entropy distribution to be sort of indicative of a very certain response or a low response latency, and low probability, high entropy distributions to be the opposite, signaling sort of greater uncertainty even when accurate responses were made. Of course, central to this idea was to look at internal representations. And again, we focused on these two factors. The first was to look at manifold dimensionality in terms of the activation of long-term memory in response to a speech signal, and then manifold separability, again used as a proxy in this study for attentional control. How easy is it for the attentional system to dip inside its activated long-term memory and pull apart individual representations? So our results, again, we have a model with no deficit, and we have a model with a frequency discrimination deficit. There's a clear accuracy disparity of about 80% to about 55%. And the models perform very differently even when accurate responses are made, as you can imagine. So the model with no deficit outputs probability distribution of about accurate probability assignment of about 0.94, or we see 0.84 in the frequency discrimination deficit model. And this, of course, is captured in the difference in entropy in bits. We see broader distributions output by the frequency discrimination deficit model. And this, as DLD researchers, this seems to provide some computational analogy to the word finding problems and heightened response latency we see among children with DLD, even when they're making accurate responses. These children are often slower in eye tracking, for instance. They often will make an accurate response, they'll gaze towards a target and then continue to look at competitors way after typically developing peers have stopped doing that. In terms of looking inside the network and considering manifold dimensionality and separability, well, you can see that here we have post-training results across convolutional layers. You have convolutional layer 1 to 20 on the x-axis. On the y-axis, you have manifold dimensionality. And we have 3 networks in each population. One you can see by line, and the color is by group. So clean networks and noisy networks. And you can see that the general trend of reducing the dimensionality across convolutional layers, but the clean networks do this much better. They reduce dimensionality much more than the noisy networks, which start high and end high and never really get the job done. This, of course, is reflected in the attentional system simulation, where we see that it's very difficult for the model of DLD, again, this noisy network, to actually peer inside and linearly separate its internal representations because they're overlapping and highly dispersed. The clean model does a much better job, especially in later convolutional layers. Okay, so stepping back from the data, again, if you want to go into the more mathy or hard data, I recommend looking at the preprint at the end of the paper, at the end of this talk, that I'll link at the end of the talk. Stepping back and looking at this sort of graphically again, what we're trying to say is that in the internal representations in children without DLD might look a bit like this. We start off with these tangled manifolds, and we end up through these processes of transformation, including projection into over-complete space and pooling. We end up with something that looks like this. We have low dimensionality manifolds, successful manifold untangling, and this provides an efficient basis for which attention can operate over. For example, in retrieving individual representations. And we worked at the level of word, but this could be the level of phoneme or chunk. In DLD, in contrast, we feel like we're seeing something a bit like this. We go from these low-level tangled representations, and we never really resolve the problem. We end up with representations higher up in the auditory linguistic hierarchy, which we still have residual tangling, and they do not provide an efficient basis for attention to operate over. Attention is therefore overwhelmed. Okay, so the point of this again is to develop an alternative to the dominant causal account of DLD. So let's revisit that and just considering the implications for theory. So in the dominant view, we start with a speech representation, which is more or less fine. But at some point, this travels down the auditory linguistic pathway and hits a working memory capacity bottleneck, defined almost uniformly within the field as Baddeley and Hitch's phonological loop. This results in the formation of fuzzy or degraded long-term speech representations, which compromises the whole system in terms of production and comprehension. So one contribution of this kind of work, although it's a very, very small first step, is to perhaps provide a neurocomputational view of what spoken word representation deficits might look like in the minds and brains of children with DLD. Namely, they might look like residually tangled manifolds, overlapping and intersecting, which do not form an efficient basis for attention to operate over. Importantly, by situating the locus of deficit here in low-level frequency discrimination, we prompt a role reversal of causal directionality later in the system. We go from the idea that a fixed working memory capacity bottleneck, which is functionally discrete from long-term memory, causes speech representation deficits, to the idea that speech representation deficits themselves attributable to low-level frequency discrimination deficits, in fact, prompt apparent working memory capacity bottlenecks. So the idea here is not that we have a fixed, functionally discrete working memory capacity limitation, such as a phonological loop capacity deficit, but it's much more like what we see in typically developing individuals in a working memory task when we present them with clean stimuli and then present them with noisy stimuli. You see the performance drop, but you wouldn't say, well, that's because their working memory capacity has changed. Simply, it's a different representation, a different signal, and a different thing they're working with. Now, in terms of implication for practice, which is really what we're interested in our group, this strongly suggests or provides more sort of that weight to the sort of Charles Hume work, which is saying working memory training really isn't the way to go in clinical practice. You really should focus on alleviating these low-level frequency discrimination deficits by improving manifold separability. And in fact, there's a lot of tools that seem very successful within the SLTs, the speech language therapist toolkit, which seem to be doing just that. And this might be one reason that they really do work, and why working memory training does not work. So in conclusion, the manifold untangling framework can help link deficits in frequency discrimination that we see in children with DLD to deficits in speech representation in DLD. Speech representation deficits may themselves be described in terms of abnormally high dimensionality and low separability. And the take home is that reliable working memory task deficits among children with DLD may reflect the increased processing demands of navigating underlying speech representations with high dimensionality and low separability, rather than fixed, and I'd say functionally discrete, working memory capacity limitations, as is the dominant view of this highly prevalent neurological disorder. Okay, so thank you very much. My email is sam.jones@lancaster.ac.uk, and the project repository for this can be found at the OSF, the Open Science Framework, at ng6dx. Thank you very much.